Ahead and share my screen and get started. I do have a lot of slides that I'd want to get through, and I want to try and do this quickly. As I said when we first got on, with full honesty and transparency, I'm a third generation from Southern Pentecostal, so I have a tendency to want to talk and talk and talk. So at some point, if I recognize that I'm the only one in the Zoom session, last one out, turn out the lights. I really appreciate the opportunity to present on some archaeology. As Andy said, my most recent employment is as provost and dean of the faculty at Franklin and Marshall. So it's rare these days that I get to talk about archaeology, but I really appreciate the invitation. And I'm especially appreciative of a group of Arkansans that will come and listen to an archaeological talk about archaeological research in Alabama. And unlike a lot of talks that you probably are familiar with, this is a work in progress. I'm working with Kent Riley at Texas State University to try and flesh this out. It's had an incredibly long birth, as you will hear. But one of the things that I have found is that my ability to pivot from my day job to my passion for archaeology gets incredibly limited from time to time. So tonight I wanted to talk about the Shine site, which is one of the largest Mississippian sites in central Alabama, just north of present-day Montgomery. And it has a really fraught archaeological history with excavation. And because of that, it's never been fully published and it's never received the kind of stature or recognition that it probably deserves as one of the most important Mississippian sites in the region. And so, let's see. I want to also recognize that my start in archaeology was because of my mentor, John Cottier. And I don't know why his name got misspelled here, but it's John passed away 4 years ago and is missed every day. Craig Sheldon from Auburn University, Montgomery, retired 4 years ago and just yesterday celebrated his birthday. So archaeology is often about passing it forward for the people who have trained you to make sure that their legacy lives on. And so I just want to acknowledge that I wouldn't have gotten involved in archaeology if it hadn't been for John and Craig. And so the archaeology of central Alabama is a really complex and fascinating phenomena. I grew up in the region, and like most people, you get interested in the archaeology of your backyard first, and then you spread out and do crazy things like work in central Mexico, middle formative and early formative, and then you go to the Chile Outer Hebrides to look at what Vikings do when they come and settle amongst farmers and fisher folk who call those places home. And so the archaeology of central Alabama has been examined for a long time. This is the Coosa River just below Wetumpka. If you don't know the region, Wetumpka is presently the subject of, I guess it's HGTV's renovation story where they're taking a southern town and trying to renovate most of it. It's a really interesting place. And it's a place that has a very complex history of Native American occupation. At one point, Wetumpka was listed in the New York Times as one of the fastest growing cities in the American West, along with Chicago. One of those you've probably heard of, the other sort of faded into obscurity. So I grew up doing archaeology with John and Craig in the lower Tallapoosa River Valley. It's a really interesting geomorphological and ecological zone. The Chattahoochee River is to the east. The Alabama River forms with the confluence of the Coosa and Tallapoosa just north of Montgomery here at the western edge of this slide. And the Tallapoosa is interesting because it flows out of northwest Georgia close to Etowah. And when it hits the fall line hills and the coastal plain, it hits a substrate that it couldn't easily penetrate. So instead of continuing its path north-south, it cuts directly along the fall line hill and coastal plain boundary to the west. And so ecotonally, you've got lots and lots of resources to exploit. And the best archaeology of this region, or the best known archaeology, is that of the historic creek. And so these are place names and town names of historic creek villages that were visited by William Bartram and other early American settlers in sort of conducting both trade as well as political negotiations. And so my dissertation research took place at the site of Fusahachie, which is more properly in Muskogee, Fusochi, which means Birdtail Creek. But there's an extensive archaeological research project from the mid 80s until the late 90s that sampled a lot of these sites to reconstruct both site boundaries, environmental exploitation strategies, and what I focused on was household development. Much of this work, unfortunately, like that in Arkansas, I'm sure is based on salvage archaeology. So this is work at Fussahatchee back in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was $3 million of construction grade gravel that was being quarried. And so Alabama, like many southern states, doesn't have a whole lot of legal protection on private property, even with the presence of human remains. And so much of our excavation that went on for a total of 12 years was map it, mark it, excavate it, and then move, because they were coming to get the soil as soon as you were finished. And so it's not the kind of archaeology that I would often recommend, certainly not the kind that leads to dissertations and most common practices. But I believe right now, 6 people have gotten dissertations based on elements of the Fussahatchee excavations. So it's really had an interesting legacy. And this is just a portion of the downtown mapping. We ended up excavating about 15 hectares in all, and these are 10 by 10 meter squares. So it gives you some evidence. Several hundred houses, several hundred sets of human remains, an unbelievably complex archaeological multi-component site that had a middle and then a late woodland and then an early Mississippian and then historic Creek occupation up until the War of 1812, when on his way back from the Battle of New Orleans to punish the Creek for siding with the British, the site was burned to the ground by Andrew Jackson and his troops. And so Fussahatchee gave us this great sort of lens on what happens to Native American communities among the Creek over several centuries of interactions with Spanish, French, English, and then Americans in terms of the larger geopolitics. And so I was always fascinated by the way in which material culture played a role in its transitions over time in changing worldview, changing political economy, and changing domestic relations among individuals within households. And during those excavations of individual houses, we recovered a variety of different remains that related to everything from size of households to household food storage that I've written about as well. But the biggest issue that I had was the changing nature of Creek leadership. This is a John Trumbull 1790 drawing of Fussahatchee Miko, the chief of this village, who traveled to Washington, actually to New York, to sign a treaty with the American government and received a peace medal. And here he's shown in John Trumbull's illustration wearing his peace medal, as well as sort of a melange of different forms of identity, using different forms of clothing and jewelry and other items to claim a very complex personal identity that probably represents a lot of things that were going on with individual Creek and other Native Americans at the same time. In addition to the historic Creek occupation, one of the most fascinating parts of Fussahatchee were a series of houses that were Mississippian in construction, but had some really strange artifact assemblages associated with them. So we found 6 wall trench houses built on Mississippian forms that are well known throughout most of the Mississippian world, but most of the pottery found in association with the house floor was solidly late woodland pottery. And this combination of a Mississippian architectural style with a material composition that was largely indigenous late woodland really sparked my imagination. And as I was looking for that next project after my dissertation, moving back in time from the Creek to get a much earlier occupational history, this is what I wanted to look at, was how the local Tallapoosa River late woodland populations, terminal woodland populations, became Mississippianized. And as we talked about this process of Mississippianization back in the mid to late 90s, it was absolutely anathema to mainstream archaeology to talk about population migration and movement. So now it's a very common way in which we can talk about both ideas, people, material culture being transformed and moved across landscapes. But at the height of processual archaeology, there was an idea that ideas could move and diffuse, but that you were being a lazy archaeologist if you were talking about actual migrations of people. And I'm not ever really sure why that took hold. We can talk about that later, maybe in the Q&A. But so as I started thinking about this process of what takes Mississippian lifeways and cultural practices from sort of the big bang at Cahokia to these out of the way locations in the hinterlands of central Alabama, that process is one that really, really fascinated me. And so like most people looking to move past their dissertation, I wrote an NSF proposal to try and secure funds to do some Mississippian archaeology in this region to address that question. And what I prefaced it around was the idea of human movement and human migration. That house that I gave you a short slide of earlier that's built on a Mississippian architectural format, but yet the material assemblage is solidly local woodland, suggests that someone with intimate knowledge of house construction in the Mississippian world is present to actually construct the house. It's rare that you would expect somebody who only visited a Mississippian community and saw wall trench houses being constructed in lieu of single post placed houses would have just immediately gone home and tried that with the same sort of execution. So one of the ideas that Craig and John and I have played around with over the years was most commonly in the Southeast, men are the architects and the builders, and women are the pottery makers. And I don't want to be too gender binary when I talk about that, but what I will say is that the expectation is that these houses would have most probably been built by Mississippian men in some sort of matrimonial relationship with local woodland women who are making the material assemblage of pottery being used in and around these houses. And so that cultural meeting does suggest that we've got population movement. But just as modern geopolitics is often inflamed around issues of migration, this is an advertisement about the time of Brexit to try and fan the flames among the Brits to ensure that they could vote to leave the European Union because of what many politicians considered to be uncontrolled migration. I got a very similar sort of response when I sent my NSF proposal in to look at Mississippian migrations into central Alabama. And so I got a call from John Yellen to tell me that I was one of the very few people who had a distinction in that I had scored in every single ranking category that an NSF proposal can get, all the way from poor to excellent. So it's a distinction that means I didn't get the funding, but I think you can see in the range of expressions here to the proposal itself, everything from this is a really important study, we need to know more about hinterland Mississippian. And luckily, a lot of young scholars since then have come forward and pursued these questions. So these are still not as unaddressed as they were at the time that I proposed them. But the one that I particularly love is the last one here, which basically says, you know, have we gone back in time 20 years? I haven't heard anybody talking about migration in relationship to Mississippians in so long. Let's please don't go back to culture history. Let's, you know, instead talk about other forms of processual archaeology for Mississippian cultural development. So for any of you who are younger archaeologists who've ever had a difficult time getting a project funded, you are definitely not alone. And again, it's pretty rare that you can both excite and inflame all at the same time with one 10-page proposal. So when we talk about the Central Alabama late woodland, what I decided to do was start looking at terminal woodland occupations, doing some test excavations that would hopefully build up enough data that I could convince a research panel at NSF or a review panel to be able to give me the money I needed to do a large-scale Mississippian survey in the area. And so a whole series of archaeology had sort of fleshed out at least the culture history of the region. I recognize that archaeological phases are not always welcome in modern parlance and discussions about archaeology, but they're really handy ways to sort of talk about periods of time. I recognize that they're more a function of archaeological utility than maybe the cultural relations of the people who are pigeonholed in these, but they're great ways for us to kind of talk about breaks in time and material culture change. So I started looking at the lower Tallapoosa and upper Alabama, Autauga and Union Springs phases to try and find sites that were most likely going to be related to this interface between terminal woodland and early Mississippian. And so I ended up doing a series of 5 field schools in the early 2000s that I believe on last count ended up taking over 100 students from various locations to do archaeology in Alabama. And I think some pretty good archaeology as well. for us to look at just this issue. And so what we were looking at was the transition between a late woodland material assemblage and architectural construction into what could be identified as part of the Mississippian experience and the Mississippian world. I'm not naive enough to think that you go to bed one night as a terminal woodland person and you wake up the next morning as a Mississippian, but I think that there are important precursors and important sort of cultural elements that start to sneak in around the edges until eventually that cultural transformation leaves you almost unrecognizable in many ways from what came before. And so one of these big terminal woodland sites is called the Samuel site. It's very close to the junction here on the left of the slide of the Coosa and Tallapoosa. And it is a very large multi-mound late woodland site. And we were fortunate enough because it was owned at the time by the Archaeological Conservancy. It's since been conveyed to the state of Alabama, but because of its size and the presence of mounds, it had been looted for quite some time. So we came in to do some mitigation archaeology to determine how badly these structures had been looted and also to gather some temporal information about them as well. And so a field school from the University of Illinois, Chicago, we spent 2 seasons here doing excavations to both more or less document the nature of the disturbance and also talk about what the archaeology could tell us about terminal woodland early Mississippian. And so we ended up conducting these excavations and got a great series of radiocarbon dates, a great series of occupational histories. And here on the right, this really unusual undulating topography that you see is what locally was referred to as the donut mound. And it's called the donut mound because the center is actually deflated and it's higher around the exterior. Local legends suggested that this was probably the product of some early clandestine archaeology where someone dug in the center looking for buried treasure and had thrown their spoils directly over their shoulder. I've seen a lot of spoils piles from both professional and avocational archaeologists and looters. I've never seen any that are tidy enough to distribute their spoils equally around the edge of the mound. So in fact, what we found was a large precursor to the Southeastern Council House, and that the deflation in the middle is related to where the roof structure had collapsed and the exterior walls were actually that. They were exterior walls. And so we gathered a whole series of archaeological samples that we were able to date and get a very good understanding of this terminal woodland occupation. So this is being occupied both in terms of calibrated and uncalibrated dates. When other parts of the Southeast, particularly Moundville and Bessemer, other sites, have been sort of fully fluorescent in the Mississippian tradition. And so we've got some late woodland people that we believe are participating in long distance trade and exchange. We found some Mississippian items in this context that did not appear to be locally made. So it looks as though we're right at that precursor, but we didn't find that smoking gun for that period of transition. So we started looking at other sites. Excavation by Cottier and Sheldon at Hickory Ground, Ochiopofau, here just below modern day Wetumpka, another big archaeological site that's multi-component that has some woodland, but mainly late Mississippian and early Creek occupations as well, have helped us to sort of build on a local chronology of Mississippian that's only sort of divided into 2 phases, the Shine 1 phase from roughly 1200 to 1400 and Shine 2 from 1400 to 1600. They're both named for the site that I'll talk about in more detail here in a second. And what's interesting is that the Shine 1 phase, and what allows these to be temporally distinguished, is that it is characterized by Moundville influenced wares, a whole series of ceramics being present at the site in this earliest Mississippian phase that shows some cultural affinities to Western Alabama and Moundville proper. And then subsequently, the site is occupied during the Shine 2 phase from AD 1400 to 1600 by what are considered to be Lamar pottery types and perhaps Lamar people. So we've got a transition occurring at around 1400 that shows that the major sphere of cultural influence, at least in terms of pottery production, is shifting from the west to the east. And that may very well coincide with Moundville's abandonment and dissipation as a political and social center in the southeast and the rise of places like Etowah and others. And so this is our excavation at Hickory Ground. Again, just like with Fussahatchee, this is a salvage archaeology, the Porch Band of Creek Indians, with whom I've worked for 20 years or so, along with the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. Here, the Muskogee Creek Indians built Wind Creek Casino, the Wetumpka branch, and so excavations here were in preparation for them to do their construction, and found a vast variety of architecture and associated materials. I'm sorry, I don't know why that slide doesn't show up there, but we ended up here with about 12 hectares of overall excavation and about 65 individual structures that go from late woodland all the way through to the time of Native American removal, creek removal on the Trail of Tears. So if we go back to this big question, and it's probably still unresolved and will be after my presentation tonight, what is the relation of early Mississippian and West Alabama, particularly Moundville, coming out of relationships with Bessemer and other sites in the region? And how does that Mississippian influence radiate out? Is it actually just culture contact and diffusion of information, or do we actually have people migrating and moving across these landscapes? And so when we talk about Moundville, if I presume that everyone here is familiar with Moundville's second largest Mississippian site, probably had a residential population anywhere from 5 to 10,000, and if we expand into the Black Warrior River and other places, certainly had a disproportionately large cultural, political, and religious influence on probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in this region of Alabama and the Mid-South. But what I find to be really interesting is we have had a very Cahokia and Moundville-centric perspective on what Mississippian is. So this idea of, massively large habitation areas, massively large multi-mound sites, but the vast majority of Mississippian people and people practicing Mississippian lifeways probably lived in second-order towns, what Jim Knight has called one-mound towns, farmsteads, and sort of individual scattered populations across the landscape who are part of a larger cultural manifestation, but aren't part of perhaps these large metropolitan cities. And so when we talk about Mississippian in general, this Mississippian movement of ideas and or people has been something that a lot of Mississippian archaeologists have worked with very closely. And if we think about that Big Bang, whatever we want to call it, at Cahokia and in the middle Mississippi River, that really transforms lifeways across a lot of the upper, the Southeast and the Midwest as well. We do have a whole suite of things, not only architecture, pottery, and other things that are characteristic, but because we've been so Cahokia-centric, we've tended to see, this sort of social inequality, lots of massive construction that's only to benefit a small segment of society, social distancing between supposed elites and non-elites, including walled and palisaded parts of the community where the average person had no access. We've talked about corvée labor, the idea that our elites could compel during Mississippian times the average person to, in many ways, as Bruce Smith and others have talked about it, sort of work against themselves, building levers of social inequality by building ever larger mounds that only distance themselves from social, political, and economic control. I think we've really seen the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of these things come into question, even at these large centers like Cahokia. We've seen different kinds of models where we're not always talking about exploitation and people having to do things, but people wanting to do things. We've got a whole group of archaeologists, Tim Pocketot and others, who've been talking for a decade about the idea that, participation in the construction of something as a group actually builds social cohesion. And this is why in my talk, I'm sort of framing in some ways around this idea of communitas, which is Victor Turner's contribution, which is this idea that many social rituals are designed to actually bring communities closer together and to be social leveling mechanisms rather than bringing society in to distinct social segments. So one of the things that got me interested in prehistoric Europe, in fact, and got me working in Wales and Scotland was that the archaeologists who are working at large hill fort sites, many of which have 2 to 3 times the amount of earthwork that large Mississippian sites do, they often argue that these are places of comparative equality rather than inequality. So where North American archaeologists have seen this kind of labor being distributed and as a sign of some sort of social control, they see it in many cases as a form of social cohesion and community building. So I'll come back to that. Again, this idea that Mississippian elites are controlling not just sort of physical spaces, but also supernatural spaces, connections with the supernatural, religious leaders as, you know, sort of part of the whole toolkit that's being makes them informationally valuable. Lots of arguments, sumptuary goods. The idea that Native American chiefs during the Mississippian period would have controlled access to long distance trade and exchange items, something that, you know, early in my career, I wrote about. I'm certainly not the only one, but a lot of people have talked about the idea of prestige goods being part of the social differentiation network that allowed elites to extend their power over non-elites. Things like these copper plates from Malden, Etowah, and Spiro that show supernatural figures often found in burial contexts and often found in relationship to you know, burials of high status in segments of the community that are differentiated from that of other folks. And in addition to those sorts of differentiations between commoners and elites, we've often talked about food storage as well. The Spanish talk as early as the Hernando de Soto expeditions about being provisioned when they visited communities across the Southeast by stores that were under the control of chiefs. It's where our modern word of barbecue comes from, is this idea of the Spanish barbacoa, these community granaries and other storage facilities that are often very elusive in the archaeological record, but that we see early historic documents referencing over and over. And then in other places, we often see provisions of meat for elites, that they're eating a better diet, more meat, best cuts of meat, other sorts of things like that. And I will say this, for all of the professional archaeologists in attendance, all of these, as you know, are controversial. None of these are straightforward, and at every single site, we see some randomness and some local variation in these patterns. So this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all, but these have become part of our sort of corporate understanding of what Mississippianization may represent. And it actually has led us to a very Europeanized perspective from this DeBry illustration, sort of showing Mississippian elites and early contact period Native American leaders in this reified way. And lots of analysis has gone into kind of deconstructing these images that were constructed by Europeans for Europeans. And that simultaneously you see, you know, sort of both savagery, brutality appearing in these illustrations and in these descriptions, but then you also see courtly life being described in ways that many Europeans would have immediately recognized as part of their political and social worlds as well. And so where does the actual reality lie? And I think that's where archaeology can play a larger point, rather than simply taking the ethnohistorical and early historical accounts at face value. As I've told Andy many times, you know, it's interesting that we will trust a Spanish account when they're describing cannibalism among native peoples in Florida, when just 4 pages earlier, they were talking about an encounter with a sea serpent as they crossed the Atlantic. And one we can easily dismiss, but the other we treat as absolute fact. So back to the central Alabama region that I call home. Previous archaeology in this area, mine was not the first, nor will it be the last to address these sorts of issues. But in the early 80s, what we knew about this area was that we had a series of polities or chiefdoms, many of which scattered across the landscape, both temporally bound and spatially bound. And so this Shine 2 crosshatching here is from a Jack Scott illustration from my 2008 book, but it's based on about 50 years of archaeology. And the Shine 2 phase and the Shine 2 polity, if that's actually what it was, is relatively small compared to places like Coosa, maybe even Kaimolga, Bull Creek, these other better known polities in the southeast. And with Shine, it basically originates from the Shine site. So this is a planning map from the city of Montgomery. And here I've indicated where the Shine site's located. It's located on a bend of the lower Tallapoosa River, about 3 miles before it flows into the Coosa to form the Alabama. And what was really unfortunate about this site is as the city of Montgomery grew in the 1960s, they decided to build the city waterworks on it. And so it's at this really propitious site that was easy to pump all of the water for the municipal systems of Montgomery. And so it was slated for destruction. But before that destruction, a series of archaeological excavations took place, both professional and non-professional. One of the ones that's, I think, most interesting is that was done by the Ohio National Guard in training for deployment during World War I. A group that would become the Ohio 36th Artillery Battalion trained at Camp Sheridan between 1917 and then returned here in 1919 after their service was over to be discharged. It was located just 2 miles west of the Shine site. And although we don't have any photographs of these activities, we do have descriptions in a daily log from one of the commanders of this unit that they walked to the site and used the main mound at the site to dig readouts so that they could practice digging artillery placement for what they would be doing when they were deployed to France. No artifacts are mentioned, no stratigraphy, no evidence of those excavations still exist, but we do have an archaeological indication that they occurred in a historical record. Just as a side note, lest this be a historical footnote, a young lieutenant of the Ohio 36th was F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it was while he was training his troops at Fort Sheridan that he met his wife, Zelda Fitzgerald from Montgomery. And the rest, as they say, is at least literary history. So jump from those excavations to the first professional excavations at the site in 1963, 1964 by David Chase of the Alabama Museum. Well, he was of the Montgomery Art Museum. He was an archaeologist and himself was an artilleryman during World War II. He led excavations in the Panama Canal where he would place his artillery units not where it was best to defend the canal should it be invaded, but where he could find archaeology. He also did the same thing in Korea when stationed in Korea. So probably a terrible artillery man, but a great archaeologist. And so in 1963, he received word that there was illicit looting taking place at the site and that it needed to be explored. And this was also during the time that the city had decided this is where it was going to place its waterworks. And so this is one of the few places where Shine's ever been published, is in a series of newspaper articles from early 1964, sort of playing up the idea that a religious carved shell had been found and that the site needed more excavation. And so this is that shell. It's sort of colloquially called a spaghetti-style gorget. You can see the suspension holes drilled here in the top, most probably worn as a pectoral. It's called, in more sort of formal archaeological parlance, a Williams Island-style gorget. It's called spaghetti-style because all of these Williams Island gorgets have this strange fenestration and a whole series of strange carvings that are hard to recognize. We've always thought that this was probably a supernatural figure doing what supernatural figures do, perhaps traveling between worlds and doing something unusual. But having it sort of decoded from a Native American perspective, George Langford and others have looked at the corpus of these. The iconography group that meets at Texas State has worked on them for a while. And I want to come back to what some of the interpretations of this gorget might be in just a second. But what I will say is it was a very unusual find. Subsequent to its location at the Shine site, a total of 13 Williams Island style gorgets have been documented in Montgomery County and its surrounding environs. And there's another cluster in Northwest Georgia and Southern Tennessee of another 12. And so the relationship between these is really interesting. There's one of these that shows up at Moundville and one of them that shows up at Lake Jackson in Florida. But other than that, they're fairly geographically confined to these two areas. So this is a talk about archaeology of archaeology. Since I couldn't find the NSF money and turn the keys there to be able to do this large scale project, I started looking and analyzing Dave Chase's old excavation records from Shine to try and make more sense of the excavations that he led there. And as any of you who have done archaeology of archaeology can sort of attest, it's a really difficult challenge to try and make sense, heads or tails, of somebody else's archaeology. He is doing his own version of salvage archaeology, trying to beat the city before it destroys this for the waterworks. He picked a mound that was on the edge of the riverbank that had started to erode. That was most probably the mound that the Ohio 36th had dug into as well, based on some of his stratigraphic notes, but he didn't actually do the drawings. And so when you start taking a look at his excavations, one of the things that immediately stuck out to me, most of you may not know him, but this is Kent Riley at age 14. Kent goes on to be a professional archaeologist, art historian, and iconographer. He primarily worked in Mesoamerica until the late 1990s, and since has really been transformed into a Southeastern archaeologist. And he traces that love of Southeastern archaeology back to being a volunteer with Dave Chase at the Shine site, and he is actually the one that excavated the Shine Gorget. And so he's got a unique connection to that gorget that sort of keeps coming back to him over the decades. And so Chase's excavations multiple burials and associated features. And I will say here in just a second, I'm going to show two slides that do feature Native American human remains, skeletal remains. I have the approval of the Porch Band of Creek Indians to use those in this presentation, but I would ask that they not be recorded and presented on the website if at all possible, out of respect for tribal wishes. So going back through Dave Chase's notes and his artifact summaries, because most of the artifacts have disappeared from the collection of the Montgomery Museum and Auburn University at Montgomery. There's scattered boxes here and there, but I could not find the whole corpus. We have an initial occupation of Shine that occurs during the Shine 1 phase, probably around 1200. And instead of finding those classical Mississippian wall trench houses, we found single posts placed, an individual structure beneath Mound 2 with associated burials and domestic features. There's a subsequent phase, and I'll just go back really quickly. So that site, that house is occupied for a short period of time. He did not excavate based on stratigraphic levels. He excavated in 6-inch cuts. And so trying to reconstruct these in many cases where they cross-cut natural strata and culturally induced strata was really, really difficult, but I think we've got a good handle. So this is an initial occupation at the site with no mound construction, just a single house. And then in a later phase, immediately after that, we find an interesting transition. We find two structures, and we find what I've considered to be an enclosure or partition wall. The reason that I think it's an enclosure or partition wall is the fact that we find markedly different activities taking place both to the north and the south, or what would be the west and the east of this if it were aligned to north. We have a domestic structure here, structure 3. All of the features associated with it are household storage pits and midden. And we have a structure inside the enclosure wall that has absolutely no midden and no domestic materials at all. We simply have a structure that is associated with human remains. Each and every one of these features is a secondary burial, and Mississippian sites often are accompanied by special ritual precincts in which mortuary structures, charnel houses, where processing of the dead for internment or display, or even in some cases, we know from the same sort of untrustworthy accounts from the Spanish and others, that many of these charnel houses contained boxes with the bones of the revered ancestors that would be used in sort of necromantic rituals to try and contact the other world and sort of get this world guidance from the supernatural. But the idea that there's this hard boundary between the interment of human remains and domestic, to me, really strongly suggests that what we have prior to mound construction as well is a real division between sort of the world of the living and the world of the dead. And so this is the late Shine 1 occupation, this terminal early Mississippian occupation, and something very different happens in the Shine 2 occupation that postdates it. And so when I talk about these kind of ceramics, these are from the Shine site. We have a whole series of zone punctated wares, incised wares, and fairly typical West Alabama Mississippian that would easily fall in the corpus of either Moundville derived or Moundville related, certainly Moundville influenced. Shell tempered almost exclusively. And that's markedly different from the ceramics that show up next during the Shine 2 occupation. And I want to just talk about what I consider to be kind of an apotheosis set of rituals that ended the early occupation by the Shine 1 people or the Shine 1 period. And then Shine 2 brings in something radically different. Based on stratigraphic analysis and the reconstruction that I have from photographic evidence and limited stratigraphic profiles, there are two final interments inside structure and adjacent to structure 2, this charnel house, that appear to be the last acts prior to its burning and dismantling and spreading of a sterile clay cap over this entire area. One of those is feature 46, which is the one in which the Shine Gorget, the fenestrated gorget, was located in association with a child burial. So the idea of inherited status or the idea of, you know, a marker of some sort of social distinction being placed with a child rather than with an adult has all sorts of suggestions perhaps about ascribed status in society rather than achieved status. But I find it really interesting that this is one of the last acts inside the house before it's burned and then covered over. And then exterior to that structure, here's the Shine Gorget again. Before I talk about the other feature, I thought it would be interesting to sort of talk about what the Shine Gorget itself might represent. Just really, really briefly in a flyby, a whole series of archaeologists have debated for a long time, and I think it took recent analysis thinking outside a two-dimensional plane and into a three-dimensional surface that really broke this through. If you look at some of these salient features of the Shine Gorget, you see this double band that encapsulates the central figure, but you see these lines that extend outside that figure within it and these swirls inside. So George Langford, in an analysis of similar sort of twins, uses the world tree or the world post and smoke coming out of a vessel as a way of sort of representing a transition from a two-dimensional plane to a three-dimensional representation of ritual acts in which smoke ascends to the heavens. Greg Wilson, in his 2017 article, talks about Ramian-sized vessels, about the upper register being a relationship to the upper world, and the lower portion of the pot and the internal contents of the pot being related to the underworld, so that these ritual activities and ritual vessels that may have been used to contain, whether it's the black drink or something else that was thought to be related to contacting the supernatural, has a strong representation both in ceramic traditions as well as in these gorget carvings. And so one of the arguments that's been advanced by George Langford as well as Kent Riley that I'm really enamored with is the idea that what we're looking at is we're looking inside a pot from the top, that this is actually an attempt to represent a three-dimensional image in a two-dimensional plane. And so what you have here are those smoke rings emanating from the vessel, and that you've got this portal into the underworld in the interior, and that all of these swirls are about this supernatural contact between upper, middle, and lower world that's really a huge part of Native American and Mississippian religious practice. So when we talk about, again, those gorgets, and I'm getting close to the end, I promise, we've got these two clusters that are really hard to explain, right? There are a few that are scattered around. So these are all Williams Isle style gorgets, spaghetti style gorgets, but the massive concentration in Northwest Georgia and in central Alabama would suggest some sort of cultural contact, some sort of movement, some sort of migration in which cult bearers or lineage heads are brought to create social alliances and social networks, either through marriage, through in-migration, or perhaps through warfare and conquest. And so the last two periods of occupation at the Shine site, if we go back to these excavations, the last of the Shine 1, this Moundville-related pottery making group or using group, is that of feature 27. And this is where I'm going to show two slides of human remains from Dave Chase's excavations. So if you don't want to watch, I would say you can pop out for 2 minutes and then pop right back if you would like. But this excavation is so in need of detailed analysis and publication, because in it is found a decapitated individual who's also had both hands removed at the wrist, whose body is draped around a cypress pole. World trees or individual posts as a form of community identity markers that linked and bridged the upper world, the middle world, and the underworld are part of Mississippian and late woodland worldviews in many, many regions of the Southeast. Certainly Susan Alt, Tim Pocketot, I can't remember his first name, but Scotian has written extensively about the importance of these posts, both as personified individuals, as the ancestors, as creating a social and sacred connection between the community and the supernatural. And the fact that here we have an individual who's not just diagrammatically draped around it, but is physically draped around it. We also know that the head was removed peri-mortem, close to the time of death, because atlas and axis went with the skull rather than staying on the vertebral column. So this person met their ultimate demise, or at least was part of a funerary ritual in which they played a part of this decommemoration of this sacred post within the community. And this is just that same burial from the other side. I do have a portion of this cypress post, and I would like to have it radiocarbon dated, and we are working to try and ensure that we can have that done. It disappeared for about 25 years, so how accurate it may be and sort of helping us to recalibrate this transition from Shine 1 to Shine 2 will be really, really interesting. So the final two sort of architectural occupations, so that burial occurs right down here. The burial of the child with the gorget is right here. That structure is burned. It's over-capped with sterile clay. And then the first stages of mound construction take place. And oddly enough, two new structures show up off the mound in association with a dark midden that is heavily organic and contains a high proportion of animal remains. So what we think is, and this is actually something that Dave Chase speculated in his original field notes back in the 60s, is that this may be the result of feasting. And I know feasting has become a real popular topic of discussion in Mississippian studies and Southeastern archaeology, that as one would induce others to come and build a mound and engage in these kind of activities, one would often have ritual feasts associated with them as well. And so it looks as though something very similar is happening during the Shine 2 occupational period here. And then the final period is one in which there are no structures in association with the mound. We get two additional mound mantles, and we start to get interments within the mound proper. So just to give you some idea about the difference in ceramics that we're talking about between Shine 1 and Shine 2, the Shine 2 material is related to Lamar complicated stamped. It's a pretty enduring South Appalachian, Mississippian pottery making tradition that's often executed on sand or grit tempered wares. And so these are from the University of Georgia Laboratory of Archaeology. But here are a couple of examples from the Shine site itself. And so in many cases, there are some strange pieces that show up with Lamar complicated stamp with a vast minority, some with shell tempered, but the overwhelming majority is sand or grit tempered. But radically different sort of tradition in ceramic manufacture, which suggests that we don't just have people coming into contact with a new region and new cultural traditions, but that we may in fact have people moving in. And so one of the arguments when we think about the sort of the subtitle of tonight's presentation is, do we have an example of people building communities and just sort of changing cultural affiliations? Or could this perhaps be an opportunity for us to talk more about conquest, about ritual violence, perhaps, where there's a set of rituals that terminate one occupational period and institute another. Chase does find several pits outside this area when they were doing some test excavations that contained Shine 2 ceramics in the upper fill and Shine 1 ceramics in the lower. And if that was cultural continuity, it's a very interesting kind of continuity where, again, it would look like somebody on a Wednesday stopped making the Moundville related ceramics and started to make something more related to Etowah. Most cultural changes don't occur that rapidly when sort of natural organic processes are ongoing. And just to make you all heartsick toward the end of the presentation, this is what became of the Shine site. This was dredging to create the underground piping system that was used to flesh out and build the Montgomery Waterworks system. I did take a small group there to do some testing, and although we found mixed artifacts, as you might imagine, from a fairly large Mississippian site, we found very little in situ. This site has just literally been hacked to death, and if that wasn't enough, the vast majority of the site lay outside the city proper and their property, but was purchased by a gravel company in the 1970s and was graveled to a 30-foot deep pit. So how do we make sense of all of this? And I'm going to propose a couple of things to kind of bring this to a close that are largely speculative, but I find that this gorget, the architecture, these sort of apotheosis rituals are ultimately related to sort of a resurgence of migration as a cultural explanation, or as at least that we can talk about migration. So going back to those kind of nasty reviews that I got on that NSF proposal because I wanted to talk about Mississippian migration, there truly was a period in which migration was seen as kind of a lazy out, that it wasn't a real way systematically to model culture change because you could just populate the world with as many migrations as you needed to explain culture change. And I absolutely get that. But one of the things that I think we have both at Fussahatchee and perhaps at Shine is a much more nuanced and evidence-based understanding of migration during the Mississippian period, is that one of the things that happens is that migrations aren't usually long distance. People who study modern migration, even in the era of vast transcontinental migration, will talk about most migratory movements being short distance, so that people are either moving within a local area or in its close adjacency. And so these movements offer opportunities in which people move to the edges, the boundaries, these transitional zones more often than not. And so a lot of these correspond with marriage. A lot of these correspond with sort of spouse receiving and spouse giving in traditional anthropological terms, in which exogamy would suggest that at the time of marriage, either the husband or the wife is married out or married in, and that this is a way in which cultural transition as well as genetic transitions take place over long periods of time. And so I've argued that for the Shine Gorget in an early publication with some co-authors. And so this wave advance model of short distance movements talks about how Neolithic farming and other sorts of Neolithic and Mesolithic transitions in Europe really sort of took place, that it wasn't just a new idea being exchanged, but it was actually new movements of people across the landscape. And then I think I've got 2 more slides. One of the ways in which that excavation at Fussahatchee, to go back to that, with this architecture of a Mississippian mold and material culture of a woodland connection, is that this may very well be an opportunity in which people are in marrying, that Mississippian men are moving at the time of marriage, either to have access to local resources, to be able to marry, to be able to socially reproduce at acceptable levels. and that they may be moving across the landscape, marrying local late woodland, terminal woodland women who have been inculcated and taught how to make pottery in a certain traditional way. And that's where we see this combination of factors coming in. And so when you look at age and you look at burial populations, you very often see that farming communities do these sorts of things, that as they expand, they start to see, even in matrilineal societies, and well, particularly in matrilineal societies, you see young adult males as the vanguard of migration. They're either going to scout out an area to make sure that it's safe for larger movements of people, or they're moving into this area because they don't have access to mates or to resources that they need, again, to be able to socially reproduce. And so you can see this today in European migration as well, as it is very often those moving into Western Europe coming first as males. It happened here in the United States as well, right? I'm Scotch-Irish, and there are all sorts of cultural ballads about men coming to America to make their way, to earn a wage, so that they could send for their brides to come and join them at a later time. And so this idea is that initially you would see men moving first, and then you'd see greater sexual parity over time. We don't have enough of a burial population to be able to make those calculations for Shine or for the Mississippian community at Fussahatchee, but they leave us with some really tantalizing evidence. And just to end with somebody who thinks that I maybe do some decent archaeology instead of those NSF reviewers, this is from George Langford's 2008 book, where highly speculatively, I and two co-authors wrote about the Shine Gorget, that our initial study that was completely divorced from any of the context. We only had the object. We had not yet understood the provenience from which it came and the cultural connections. We argued that it might, in fact, represent some form of marriage alliance between a paramount center such as Etowah or Coosa to try and sort of fortify its edges. Now, there are a whole series of studies about military force and projection over space, that there are these distant edges of your political and social influence, that it's just too costly to try and raise an army and go to war with those folks. So instead, we engage in other forms of socio-political alliance building. And that one of the ways in which we could potentially explain the presence of this spaghetti-style gorget at Shine is that it's part of a marriage relationship to try and create these socio-political relationships between the hinterland and the homeland. And with that, I will stop sharing and hopefully give it over to questions.